In January of 1992, something happened that rock fans still talk about as if it were an execution. An album from Seattle reached number one on the Billboard 200. And almost overnight, an entire era was declared dead. The story that followed was simple: grunge killed rock. It killed the hair. It killed the gloss. It killed the party. Case closed. Except, if you look closely, the body was already falling. And that's where this story stops being about music and starts being about power. Welcome back to Rockers to Doctors. I'm Nova Starwick. Usually, Dory and I break down rock history from different angles: literature, culture, data, and the big picture. But Dorian is out this weekend, which means I'm officially unsupervised. And when I'm unsupervised, I lean into some of my other training. In addition to my PhD in data science, I also hold a master's degree in forensic psychology. And in forensic psychology, you learn something very quickly. The story everyone believes is almost never the whole story. So today, we're going to treat one of rock's most repeated myths like a case file. Not because there was a murder, but because there was a myth. The myth is simple: grunge killed rock. Or maybe, more specifically, grunge killed glam. Grunge killed hair metal. Grunge killed the 1980s. It's such a satisfying story. There's an empire. There's an assassin. There's a body. But if we're going to investigate this properly, we need to go back to the moment when that empire didn't look fragile at all. It looked untouchable. Picture 1986. MTV is the sun. Everything revolves around it. If you're not on that screen, you might as well be playing in a locked basement. And in 1986, one album doesn't just break through, it plants a flag on the highest hill in the country. Bon Jovi releases Slippery When Wet. It climbs to number one on the Billboard 200. Now, you can hear that and think, sure, lots of albums hit number one. But this one didn't hit number one and disappear. It stayed there long enough to become a soundtrack that couldn't be avoided. A year later, Def Leppard's Hysteria reaches number one on the Billboard 200, and it becomes one of those albums that somehow lives everywhere at once: at home, in cars, at parties, in the shopping malls, in the air. It was everywhere. Then in 1989, Motley Crue released Dr. Feelgood, which reaches number one on the Billboard 200. And Poison, already massive, lands their signature power ballad, Every Rose Has Its Thorn, at number one on the Billboard Hot 100. So step back and look at the landscape. This isn't underground. This isn't fragile. This isn't a scene clinging to the margins. This is the establishment. And here's the first clue that something's wrong, even when everything looks right. Rock music survives by pushing against something. It needs friction. It needs an enemy. It needs resistance. But by the end of the 1980s, glam metal doesn't have resistance. It has victories stacked on top of victories. It owns the radio. It owns MTV. It owns the arenas. It owns the aesthetic. And when you win that completely, you don't just gain power, you become powerful. You become the thing other people will eventually push against. Now, imagine you're a record executive in 1989. You're sitting in an office where the walls are basically papered with platinum plaques. The arena numbers are absurd. The MTV rotation is constant. The formula is proven. And the industry does what industries always do when you find a relatable machine. It scales it. You sign the next band with the look. You sign another. You sign another. You polish them. You aim them at MTV. You hand them a chorus built for a lighter wave. Then you do it again. At first, the audience doesn't revolt. Why would they? The music is still catchy. The videos are still flashy. The live shows are still fun. But something subtle begins to happen. And it happens quietly. The edge dulls. Not because the musicians forget how to play, but because the culture begins to recognize the pattern. When rebellion becomes routine, it stops feeling like rebellion. When danger becomes predictable, it stops feeling like danger. And when a movement becomes powerful enough, the culture doesn't just get bored, it starts producing an opposite. Not loudly, not all at once. It starts as a low hum behind the wall. And then 1991 arrives. This is the part where the myth begins. September 1991, Nirvana releases Nevermind. And within a few months, on January 11th, 1992, Nevermind hits #1 on the Billboard 200, replacing Michael Jackson's Dangerous. That moment becomes the photograph people keep on the wall, the assassin caught on camera. And if you're telling the simple story, this is where you say, that was it. That was the kill shot. End scene. But if you're paying attention, you realize something. That #1 moment wasn't the beginning of the takeover. It was the reveal that the takeover had already started. Because around Nirvana, other albums are moving like weather systems. Pearl Jam releases 10 and it climbs until it peaks at #2 on the Billboard 200. Alice in Chains releases Dirt and it peaks at #6 on the Billboard 200. Soundgarden released Bad Motorfinger and it becomes their highest charting album at the time, peaking at #39 on the Billboard 200 and later goes double platinum. If you were watching MTV then, it felt like the air changed overnight. But the charts tell you the truth culture tried to hide from itself. This wasn't one band walking into a room and flipping a switch. This was a movement forming while the empire was getting comfortable. And outside the music industry, the world is shifting too. The early 1990s recession tightened wallets and dimmed optimism. It changes the mood of the country. Not in a way you can point to on a calendar, but in a way you can feel in how people talk and how people dress and what people laugh at and what people tolerate. Glam metal is still polished, it's still big, it's still glossy, but polish can feel distant when people feel uncertain. And grunge doesn't win because it's objectively better. It wins because it feels closer to the emotional temperature of the moment. Now, if we were doing the simple version of this episode, this is where I would stop, shrug, and go, well, yeah, the vibe shifted. But we're doing the unsupervised version, and in the unsupervised version, we look for the pattern that keeps repeating. So I want you to watch what happens next, because this is where the story starts behaving like a slow-motion crime scene. The fall doesn't happen as a single crash. It happens as a series of small slides that only look obvious once you're at the bottom. Warrant releases Cherry Pie in 1990, and it peaks at #7 on the Billboard 200. That's strong, that's mainstream, that's a band with real cultural oxygen. Then, in 1992, Warrant releases Dog Eat Dog, and it peaks at #25 on the Billboard 200. Now, listen to what that's saying without anyone saying it out loud. It's not a disappearance, it's not a failure, it's a drift downward. The kind that tells you the market didn't stop buying rock records, the market stopped crowning this style as the center. Skid Row releases Slave to the Grind in 1991, and it debuts at #1 on the Billboard 200. And it's recognized as the first heavy metal album to hit #1 in the Nielsen SoundScan era. That sounds like strength. That sounds like proof that the genre is alive and dangerous, and it is. But that's what makes what happens next feel even stranger. Because a few years later, Skid Row releases Subhuman Race, and the peak is dramatically lower at #5 on the Billboard 200. Same band, same capability, same skills. The cultural weather has just shifted. Cinderella is another perfect example because their arc looks like a cliff if you only glance at it. Long Cold Winter hits #10 in the US. That's a band in the room with the Kings. Then Still Climbing comes out in 1994 and peaks at #178 on the Billboard 200. No one forgets how to write songs that quickly. That's not talent evaporating. That's something else. And if you're a listener who loves the grunge killed rock myth, this is where you point and say, see, there it is. Seattle did it. But this is the part where the story starts acting like it's lying to you. Because if grunge is the assassin, then glam should be healthy right up to the moment until it gets stabbed. But the charts don't show a healthy body suddenly falling. They show a body that's been weakening slowly, quietly under the bright lights, while everyone insists it's fine because the party is still loud. So let's do what a detective would do in a story like this. Let's line up the suspects. Suspect number 1 is the one people love because it makes the whole thing feel tidy. Grunge, Seattle, Nirvana. The myth says one album arrives, glam dies. But when you look at the timing, you see something else. Nevermind hits number 1 in January 1992. Meanwhile, the glam machine had already been running long enough that it was producing copies of copies of copies. That isn't a moral failing. That's what success does when it gets industrialized. So, can grunge be the full explanation? No, because grunge didn't create the conditions. Grunge arrived when the conditions were already ripe. Suspect number 2 is oversaturation. And this one is almost too obvious because once you say it, it sounds like it explains everything. Too many bands, too many similar singles, too many power ballads placed with a surgical precision. But oversaturation doesn't kill a movement on its own. It weakens it. It makes it easier to replace. It turns an earthquake into a collapse. It's a condition, not a cause. Suspect number 3 is MTV. And MTV is tempting because it feels like a machine you can blame, a gatekeeper that can change the world with a programming decision. But MTV doesn't usually invent desire. It amplifies it. It senses where attention is moving and it follows it. And by following it, it makes it bigger. So, did MTV kill glam? Or did MTV follow the shift and accelerate what was already happening? This is where a detective starts getting annoyed because every suspect is guilty of something, but no one suspect explains the whole crime. Suspect number 4 is the economy. The early 1990s recession is real. It changed mood. It changed confidence. It made excess feel out of step. But here's the problem. Rock has survived recessions. Pop has survived recessions. Hip hop has survived recessions. So the economy might be the pressure in the room, but it's still not the mechanism that flips a cultural era. It's a stressor, not the hand that turns the key. So we have suspects, we have motives, we have timelines, we have a body on the floor if you insist on seeing it that way. But the closer you get, the more it looks like the story we tell ourselves is hiding the real event. But maybe glam wasn't murdered. Maybe it was rejected. And that rejection wasn't personal. It was systemic. This is where the metaphor starts to emerge. But we don't name it yet. We just let it take shape. Think about what happens when something dominates too completely, when it occupies too much space, when it becomes so successful that it starts to feel like the default setting. Culture changes, not because culture is rational, because culture is alive. And living systems do something fascinating when one force grows too powerful. They correct. They push back. They generate an opposite. This is where people get uncomfortable because it suggests that the fall was inevitable. That glam metal's biggest achievement, total dominance, also contained the seed of its replacement. And now, right here, we name the twist. Grunge didn't kill glam metal. Grunge was the immune response. Culture is an organism. When one aesthetic becomes too dominant, too polished, too corporate, too unavoidable, the organism doesn't just move on casually. It produces antibodies. It creates an opposite that feels cleansing. It creates a sound that feels like truth when the previous sound starts to feel like performance. It creates a new uniform when the old uniform starts to feel like a costume. So, Seattle wasn't the assassin creeping in at night with a knife. Seattle was the fever. The fever isn't the enemy. The fever is the body trying to save itself. And once you see that, everything rearranges. Oversaturation wasn't the reason Glam fell, it was the symptom that told the body this is too much. The recession wasn't the reason, it was the stress that made the body less tolerant of excess. MTV wasn't the reason. MTV was the nervous system reacting to where attention was flowing. And Nirvana wasn't a single bullet. Nirvana was the moment culture's immune system became visible enough that the myth could attach itself to a date. That's why the grunge killed rock story feels true, because it's a photograph of the fever at its peak, but it's not the origin of the sickness. And this is where the story gets bigger than glam, bigger than grunge, bigger than the 1990s. Because if this is how culture behaves with power, then it isn't limited to hair metal. It's a pattern. It means every rebellious moment is racing toward the same paradox. To win, it becomes popular. It becomes popular. It must become repeatable. To become repeatable, it must become scalable. To become scalable, it must be packaged. And the moment it's packaged enough to dominate, it stops being the thing it was created to be. It becomes power. Then culture, the organism, does what organisms do when power concentrates. It corrects. It produces the opposite. It overthrows the establishment, not out of cruelty, out of survival. That's the relationship culture has with power. It borrows it, it worships it, it imitates it. Then it destroys it when the dominance becomes total. And that's why the end of Glam feels like a murder. Because the people living inside the empire never think the empire is about to fall. Empires don't feel fragile from the inside, they feel permanent. And then one day the air changes. The clothes change, the radio changes, the jokes change, the heroes change. And years later, you look back and you insist it happened overnight because the alternative is admitting that the shift was happening while you were still singing along. Now, here's the final move in the story. If glam metal truly died in 1991, it shouldn't be here. But it is. Bon Jovi is still a stadium name. Def Leppard is still an arena draw. Motley Crue is still an event. Poison still owns nostalgia like it's real estate. The music didn't disappear. The kingdom did. What glam lost was not existence. It lost dominance. And dominance is always borrowed. That's the mythic part, the inevitable part. Culture lends you the crown, and then it gets restless watching you wear it. Because the crown is not the point. The overthrow is, the replacement is, the next rebellion is. So if you came into this episode believing grunge killed rock, I'm not here to scold you. I'm here to tell you why that myth survives. It survives because it's a story about power losing its grip. And that story is older than Seattle. It's older than MTV. It's older than the Billboard charts. It's the oldest story culture knows how to tell. The rise, the domination, the comfort, the correction, the organism protecting itself. And if that sounds slightly unsettling, it should. Because it means no era is safe. No movement stays young forever. No rebellion stays a rebellion forever. The moment it becomes powerful enough to define the room begins building the next thing that will overthrow it. That's not rock history, that's human history. And glam metal is just one chapter where the pattern is loud enough to hear. So the next time someone says, grunge killed rock, you can nod and let them keep that myth. Then, if you want, you can tell them the quieter truth. It wasn't a murder. It was an immune response. And it was inevitable. Thank you for hanging out with me for this unsupervised format change episode of Rockers to Doctors. If you enjoyed this storytelling style, tell me because I will absolutely do more episodes like this when Dorian isn't around to stop me. You can find Rockers to Doctors on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and Pandora. You can also watch the full episode on YouTube. And if you're on YouTube, like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what era you think culture rejected next, because once you see that pattern, you'll start spotting it everywhere. If you're listening on audio, follow the show and leave a rating. It helps more than you think. And until next time, thank you for listening. Headbanging with a Hypothesis.